historical record rolling here. I'm sure 100 years from now, a doctoral student will resurrect these videos and write a dissertation about everything that has happened here.
Right.
Like the ancient Egyptologists do, right?
Right.
All right. So welcome, Ashley. Anything interesting to report before we begin?
I ordered the Donella Meadows book, the
Global
the
Citizen.
one where the Global Citizen one. Yeah, I'm excited about reading it. That my hope is that will give you some ideas about maybe doing something similar with like One Health examples, articles and stuff. Because system dynamics is the perfect tool to talk about One Health problems.
Mhm.
Yeah,
How about Ashley? What's up?
Oh, I've just been reading the Thinking in Systems book, which has been great. It's a lot of the things we're talking about in class, so it's kind of another review.
Okay.
And yeah, just continuing to kind of think about, future applications, potential thesis/dissertation topics associated with this. And I think right now I'm just really interested in how this can be applied in intelligence analysis in order to biases in analysts. That's kind of where my mind's at. But I don't know. I actually wanted to ask you if you've seen any research in that, or if that's something that you've kind of already seen done.
Sorry, if I didn't hear the last part of what you said.
Like if there's already a lot of research, or if you've already seen that done where you apply systems dynamics specifically to intelligence.
No, well, not exactly that, but there are people that have done and are doing stuff like one of our doctoral, well, now graduates, Tim Clancy, does radicalization models, as well as mass shooting models using system dynamics, like what causes people to radicalize and all that stuff. So it's not exactly the same thing, but there's a place to look. And when we get that far, I'll introduce you to Tim. He's very nice. I'm sure he'd be happy to show you what he's done and make recommendations, that sort of stuff. He's doing a lot of work now for the State Department and the Marine Corps and stuff like that. So he's real good.
Ashley, what would a problem statement in that domain be like? Like, give me an example of the problem that might apply to system dynamics.
So one thing that I've run into a lot as a younger analyst is when you look at complex problems, say, is North Korea going to launch a nuclear weapon? Or is kind of a warning sort of thing, like is this likely to happen? Analysts are likely to overemphasize certain things happening and underemphasize other things, and not fully understand, again, like the interactions, the dynamics of different things happening at the same time, and how that may be different than things that have happened in the past. So there's a bias towards status quo. There's a bias towards things that you've seen in the past happen. And I think younger analysts have a bias towards everything being the end of the world. So my idea was systems dynamics could be used as a check and balance to the analysis process to look for biases in the analysis. So not as actually making the prediction itself, because we talked about how systems dynamics is better used to model a problem, not so much to
Right.
To think about how to redesign the system.
Right. But more also just in exploration of your thought process.
Yes.
So that analysts don't fall into like analytical traps that cause them to make bad assumptions. So that, like, as a learning tool though, in both when you're training analysts and then when you're actively analyzing, how that could potentially, like, so I guess my idea is how that could be applied in that.
Right.
But
okay. Yeah, I think it's a great tool. You're spot on. I think that there's a lot there. Yeah.
okay.
So,
I'm just curious because I was like, well, my mind's going 60 miles an hour, and I just wanted to know, like, if that's already been done.
so you need to know, I'm not aware of every single thing that's done around the world in system dynamics from 1956 to today, but as far as I know, no, but that people have looked at terrorism and radicalization and the topics that are knocking on the door of what you're talking
Mhm.
about, which, by the way, doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means there's something there, and there's probably a lot there, right? So you just have to ascertain what others have done, and you get some ideas and what have you, and then you have your own mental model of what's important and what you want to look at. So I think it's fine. I think it'll be good.
Okay, well, I'm excited to keep researching that and sort of see what's there.
Yeah, so we'll put you in touch with Tim, maybe after we complete the course. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe towards, we'll have a guest speaker at the end of the course or something, and he can show you what he's done, which is it's really excellent stuff. And I think you'll see, like, well, how would you model some of this? So you'll see how he's done it, which
Mhm.
is kind of there's sort of a way that expert level system dynamics modelers sort of approach that sort of problem. They all kind of do it a little bit the same way. They're not identical, but there's a kind of a way to think about it. So you can give you some ideas.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That'd be great. But I mean, not to get ahead of my skis, I still have to learn how to make a model.
Yeah, well, one step at a time, right? But you're taking all the right steps. So you're at the point already, I think, well, if he showed you one of his models, you would recognize stuff. You'd recognize molecules that are embedded here and there and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Great.
Okay, good. Well, good. That's good news. So we're on the right track here. All right. So I did promise everybody that I was going to tell you about my good buddy, Sir Roy Harrod, who I never met, but I consider him my good buddy. Let me share my screen and figure out how to do this. And let me pull up a new, wait, another screener, another spreadsheet. Not spreadsheet, what do you call this? Browser. And let me say, Harrod's in London. Okay, so it's a good picture right here of Harrod's. Did anybody ever hear of Harrod's?
I know that's where the royal family shops.
Yeah, okay, you got it. So you can see it's pretty highbrow, very famous place. So get up the PowerPoint slides here. So here's Sir Roy Harrod, very famous economist, and his family owned Harrod's department store. So he came from that sort of lineage, or whatever you want to say. He was an economist really his whole career at Oxford University of Oxford in the UK. And he was not only an academic, but he was often advising the British government. He did a lot with Prime Minister, if you've ever heard of him, Harold Macmillan. So he's any student of economics will know who Roy Harrod was, or have heard of Roy Harrod. Now, why? Well, if you Google Harrod's knife edge, as I did here, and I didn't do this prior to today. I did this a while ago, not years ago, but didn't do it in the last couple of months. But if you Google it this way, you can do it with possessive Harrod's apostrophe S knife edge with a hyphen, without a hyphen. What did I get? 1.1 million hits, right? And if you say Harrod's razor's edge, I got 475,000 hits. So this is very, in economics, why do people know of Harrod? Well, this is the main reason, because his knife edge or razor's edge is in all the macroeconomics textbooks. He was also big buddies with John Maynard Keynes, who is the guy who invented what we know today as macroeconomics. Now, Keynes was not, did not set out to invent macroeconomics. At the time, there was just economics. But he was concerned that there was this thing when he looked out his window. Keynes was at Cambridge, University of Cambridge in the UK. He saw the Great Depression. They called it the Great Slump in the UK. And, the unemployment rate in the United States reached 24.9% of the labor force. Not quite as high in the UK, but pretty high. And the peculiar thing was it wasn't going away. Now, there were booms and bust cycles in the past in economic history, and Keynes was certainly aware of them. All economists were. But the dominant theory of that era was laissez-faire. Leave it alone. The free market, the forces of supply and demand will correct any imbalances and get rid of in this case, the slump. So if there's an excess of anything, if there's an excess of tomatoes, what happens? So there's way more supply than demand. You had a bumper crop of tomatoes. What do grocers do?
They go
In
back.
Arkansas, I found out you feed them to cows.
Oh, okay, that's what.
I didn't know that until recently that cows ate tomatoes, but apparently they love them.
Oh, okay, okay. I didn't know that either. Okay. They, well, you can do something like that, but a lot of times if there's an excess of something, you lower the price to get rid of them. You have a sale, like I got to get rid of these things, particularly if it can spoil, right?
Right.
So if you have an excess of labor, the price of labor, wages should fall and you'll clear the labor market. Well, the question was, is that the right policy? And are people going to accept wage cuts or whatever? But in any case, if the forces of supply and demand, the market forces the capitalist system are working, they should self-correct the problem that the economy has sort of an autopilot. But Keynes is saying, look, every day I look out my window and the Great Depression is still here. By leaving it alone, it's not going away. So he set out to figure out why is the Great Depression happening, and then what do you do to get out of it? Okay, and took him 6 years, took him from 1930 to 1936, and he did it. And he, along the way, created what we know today as macroeconomics. Okay, now at the time, Herod was a younger man. I don't know if he was a faculty member yet, but Keynes was very senior, like a big shot, full professor at Cambridge at the time. And Herod was either a student or an untenured assistant professor, as we would say in the US. But Herod was very interested in Keynes's stuff. So he'd go from Oxford to Cambridge and attend Keynes's lectures. And then he befriended him and they started writing letters back and forth. And Herod is trying to understand what Keynes is talking about. And Keynes gave his lectures from 1930 to 1936 in an effort to test out his ideas. And so the group of students and young faculty who helped him would listen to his lectures, and he'd give them a chapter of the general theory, his book, and lecture on it, and then say, tell me what's wrong or what's unclear or whatever. And so that was known as the Cambridge Circus. Cambridge Circus helped Keynes write the general theory, and Herod attended the meetings of the circus. So Herod, when Keynes died in 1946, suddenly of a heart attack, Herod wrote the definitive biography of Keynes. So that's the other thing he's most well known for, as Keynes's biographer. Now his biography has been surpassed in modern times by a guy named Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky. Actually, I had dinner with him. He's an interesting cat. This guy, he bought Keynes's estate and lives in it, and that's where Keynes died. And he wrote his 3-volume biography of Keynes in Keynes's house at the desk where Keynes wrote the general theory. It's kind of creepy and cool at the same time, I guess. But until Skidelsky in modern times today wrote his biography, Herod's biography was the definitive work on Keynes for 50 years, 60 years, whatever it was. So Herod is known for these two things, but he's most known for this knife edge thing. So what Herod said I'm going to do is I'm going to generalize the general theory. So Keynes wondered why. Keynes was worried about the cycle. We went down. Now we've got to get out. Okay. And Keynes had a explanation for why that was happening. The quick explanation is laissez-faire, no good. The government has to get into the game and intervene in the economy because the reason the economy goes into a slump is that the business community becomes pessimistic. Keynes called it animal spirits. Animal spirits are good, but when animal spirits disappear, no good. So when that happens, the business community pulls back on investment spending in new plant and equipment, and it plunges the economy into a recession. And the only cure is the government at that point in time needs to deficit spend on public investment. So at the time in the US, Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge, the National Highway System, stuff like that, infrastructure, to replace the private investment spending that's gone away. And that will raise the economy out of the ditch. And then business people will become optimistic again that the economy's going, they have orders for their stuff. They resume investment spending, and off we go. So Harrod said, I am going to extend Lord Keynes's short run analysis to the long run. I'm going to generalize the general theory. Okay. And so he set about doing that. And in 1939, Keynes wrote in 36, the general theory. Harrod published a paper in which he claimed he generalized the general theory. Okay. Now, in that paper, Harrod said there's a trend and a cycle. If you look at any macroeconomic data, and by the way, back then, those guys didn't have the national income and product accounts. So they were doing, I don't know how they were noodling this through, but it's not like they could go to one of the Federal Reserve Bank sites and call up to show me real GDP, and there it is. And you see a trend and a cycle. But Harrod said, yeah, I've generalized the general theory. And there's a trend and a cycle in my paper. And by the way, Harrod had previously written a book called The Trend and the Cycle. So he was aware there was a trend and a cycle. The problem was when economists looked at his paper, they said, well, Sir Roy, we see the trend. That's clearly there, but we don't see any cycle in your model. Like, where's the cycle? And he was like, oh, the trend is in math and the cycle is in words. And then they were like, okay, yeah, but when we read your words, it doesn't sound like you're describing a cycle. It sounds like you're describing this knife edge or razor's edge. Now, more specifically, what does that mean? It means that as the economy grows and grows over time exponentially, okay, so there's exponential growth, and the labor force is growing and growing exponentially. If a certain set of circumstances occur, Harrod showed that the economy will be in a golden age. He called a golden age growth path. And what that means is that everybody who wants to work will always have a job over time in the steady state. So you'll be locked in to a situation where the labor force is growing and growing exponentially, and the economy is growing and growing exponentially such that it's always creating just the right amount of jobs so that everybody in the labor force always has a job. And it's a steady state. And that's what's known in growth theory, macroeconomic growth theory, as a golden age growth path. Okay? And Harrod's showed, how that worked, right, in his model. And everybody's applauding, like, yeah, go Sir Roy. But now the cycle thing. What he seemed to say in his words is that if the economy gets shocked from the outside and knocked off the golden age, and we've been shocking our models, right? With the shocks by definition are shocking. You don't expect them. It's a surprise, right? And you get knocked off the golden age growth path. According to his words, it seemed like he was saying you would never return. In fact, he seemed to be saying centrifugal forces will pull the economy farther and farther away from the golden age growth path. So it seemed like if you're on it, you're good, but you dare not get knocked off because then you fall away and never return. He said, I didn't say that. There's a cycle. I'm aware there's a cycle. I wrote a book called The Trend and the Cycle. And the economists were saying, yeah, but we're reading here. Let me read your words back to you. He goes, you're not understanding me. So Harrod spent a lot of the rest of his life trying to rewrite that paper, write it in a book, extend his model and whatever to clear up this matter of the trend in the cycle and clear up this matter of this knife edge that he said, I never said, it doesn't exist. Why do you keep saying I said this? He died in 1978, despondent that in every textbook, there's Herod's razor's edge or Herod's knife edge. That's what he's known for, something he claimed he never said and is wrong. And he's aware of it. He knows there's a trend in a cycle. And he wrote in 1970, I hope we shall hear no more of the Herod knife edge. Okay. Now, so I mentioned he wanted to generalize the general theory. He talked about this golden age growth path and a steady, stable, we call it a steady state now, okay, growth path. And he did some other stuff here that, he's given credit, this knife edge thing aside, he developed a new dynamic, a definition of a dynamic equilibrium, this warranted rate of growth you're going to see as we go along. And he came up kind of with two tests that all growth theoretic models have to be subjected to. So he really started modern growth theory. He wanted to look at the long run, generalize the general theory, and he sort of created economic growth theory, long run macroeconomic dynamics. So this knife edge aside, he did a lot of good stuff anyway that all the economists agree on. That's just this knife edge thing. Okay, so let's look at his model, and this is going to take us into the next kind of category. We're probably not going to get there tonight, which is translating ordinary differential equations into their equivalent system dynamics representation. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but we're going to take a look at some famous models that you had to know a lot of calculus to do before and show you how you can easily translate them into their equivalent system dynamics representation. Okay, so we're going to look quickly at Herod's model here. And then somebody has a hand up. Yeah, Suzanne, you got a hand up. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear. So that the knife edge was him saying that you could achieve a measure of equilibrium and it could be sustained unless it was externally.
No. So that's the golden age growth path. The knife edge was if you get knocked off, if a shock hits the system, and we were shocking it was step function, pulse function, noise, ramps, sinusoid. So some kind of shock,
spin out of control forever.
Yeah, well, it'll never go back.
Yeah.
Hence, there won't be any cycle, like it's not cycling around the path and a damped oscillation going back to it or something. Because he said there's a.
He said it would eventually recover, but nobody ever.
But his model and his words didn't seem to show that. That's the problem.
Okay.
So if you look at this thing, this is an ordinary differential equation. And this part is how I learned Herod's model. But from a system dynamics point of view, that's just a flow equation. All the ODEs are flows. Okay, so that's a pipe and faucet assembly. The change in the stock L, or labor force, over time, and it's equal to N times L. So the flow uses a telephone wire from N, which is the fertility coefficient, and a telephone wire from the bathtub L, right? So the bathtub makes more of itself, right? So again, you've seen this several times already. It's a linear, it's our first molecule, a linear first order differential equation, right? First order linear system. Molecule number one, right? So the skill here is to say, all right, some dude named Herod, his family owned this department store. He's famous in a field that Mike is into, but we are not. And he's got this allegedly famous model, and I'm looking at equation one, and right away I know what that is. That's our first molecule from earlier in the course, right? The ability to recognize that, right? So you'll see it, it'll clear up as we go along here. Then he put in this is known as you don't have to worry about this, but this is known as a Leontief production function. And it's a particular way of mathematically transforming inputs into outputs. So Y is the output, it's GDP, if you will, and the inputs are capital and labor. So people and tools make stuff. mathematically here. Okay, and V and U are measures of the productivity of the workers and the machines in making stuff. Like how many widgets per hour can a worker make and a machine make? But the min function says you have to use the workers and the machines in a particular ratio. You can't use the machines without people and make stuff. You can't have people without machines and make stuff. They have to be used in a ratio. It takes so many workers to work a machine, this sort of thing. Okay. Not important for our discussion here, but just, as long as we're talking about it. All right, since V is the capital, so V is the ratio of capital to output. So here it is with letters of the alphabet. V is the capital output ratio, a big idea in macroeconomics. It's the productivity of machines, your plant and equipment. It follows with a little bit of math that capital is equal to the capital output ratio times output. Right, makes sense. V is just a constant, so it's determined by technology or something. So Martians or whatever, it's a constant, doesn't change. But you can take the change in capital over time, but you got to do the same thing to both sides. The change in the economy or GDP, change in capital, given that constant V. But the change in the capital is a bathtub full of plant and equipment. So the change is called investment. Investment is the flow that changes the stock of capital. Okay, that's called an accelerator in macroeconomics. Okay, now we've got to include savings. So you'll see as we go along, saving and investment have to be equal in the steady state. So that's a Keynesian saving function. S equals little s times y. Little s is the marginal propensity to save. It's a measure of thriftiness, okay, in the economy. So some amount of GDP is saved and invested. So the way to think about that is some fraction of output is for consumer goods, and what's left over is for business goods, plant and equipment, drill presses and factory buildings and locomotives and stuff like that. Okay. Since number from 5, you set saving equal to investment, you can set those two equations equal to one another, and you can rewrite, there's number 6. And that's a change in the economy over time. And notice S over V, those two parameters, the thriftiness parameter S and the productivity of plant and equipment, little v, that's important, that ratio. Okay. And again, you have molecule number 1 here. We just built it another way. Okay, exponential growth. This is the trend. Everybody's agreeing. Yeah, Sir Roy, you got the trend. You nailed it. Okay. And then remember when we were talking about I think it was last class, we looked at the ratio of stocks to their flows, and we did Little's law, and then we said the fractional growth rate, right? We took the net flow and put it in the numerator and the stock in the denominator. Remember we did all that? That's what's happening here, right? The change in Y over time, that's the flows and the net flow over Y over the stock would be equal to the growth rate. And that's equal to the ratio of those two key parameters, S and V, the thriftiness thing and the productivity of machinery thing. Okay. And there's an exact analytical solution again, if you want it. We did that in class before. So you don't have to know all the details of what I'm saying here, other than you should be recognizing this is like really, really, really famous in economics. It's the start of all of modern growth theory, the whole history of economics. And you should be saying, yeah, I see what the guy's doing with stocks and flows and feedback loops. It's not a big deal. It's molecule number 1. Right. So that's a skill, to just be able to recognize that, right? Okay, now Harold went on to say you can really interpret V 2 ways. As the actual productivity of the machines, of plant and equipment, and if that's how you interpret it, then S over V, that important ratio of those two parameters, is the actual growth rate in the economy. But you can also think about it, and this is important for the cycle thing, as the required capital output ratio. So it's if the entrepreneurs and managers in the economy are satisfied that they have the right rate of growth, then they have the right productivity of their plant and equipment. Okay, in other words, I need my plant and equipment to have this productivity to be exactly the right rate of growth that will give me the golden age. Okay, so it's the appropriate capital output ratio. So if you put both of those concepts together, S is always the same. So you have the actual growth rate and the what he called the warranted growth rate. The warranted growth rate is warranted by the required capital output ratio. And then you have the actual one. It follows that if the actual is equal to the required, the actual growth rate is equal to the warranted growth rate. Okay, in other words, you're in your steady state growth path. He called it an equilibrium growth path, but equilibrium in system dynamics, everything's a horizontal line. It's better said to be a steady state growth path. The entrepreneurs will have no incentive to change what they're doing. Just keep doing what you're doing. Okay, and the capital stock will always be what they want it to be, what it's required to be, to meet the growth rate. Okay, now from 1 and 2, the actual growth rate cannot exceed little n. Remember, little n is a positive loop where the labor force is making more of itself, molecule number 1. So it's like the interest rate or the fertility coefficient, right? So it turns out that little n, which is the change in L over L, again, the flow divided by its stock, the actual growth rate can't exceed that because of that Leontief production function. You need so many people per machine, right? So if the people aren't growing or they're growing as fast as they're growing, you can't grow faster than that. You can keep up with them, but you can't exceed them because you can't make stuff without people. Okay, yeah, Suzanne, go ahead.
So what did Herod say about like innovation that knocked this?
So this is a Herod model without technological change. There's a whole
Okay,
thing
so
on
the assumption is there is no technological change.
right in this model, yeah. And then we cover that in macroeconomics. There's a whole thing on that, but this is the super simple version.
Okay.
So if the economy is in a golden age growth path, then its growth should be the same as the growth of the labor force. If the labor force is growing at 2%, the economy should be growing at 2%, then everybody will always have a job, right? And if it's also the warranted growth rate, then the entrepreneurs are satisfied that they're investing the right amount, given the required capital output ratio, to produce the right amount of stuff to meet that growth rate. So that's how you get your golden age. Okay, so when G sub A equals G sub W equals G sub N, and remember G sub W is little s over V sub R. Those special parameters. Then you get macroeconomic nirvana. You're locked into a growth path, an exponential growth path, where as the labor force grows exponentially, everybody will always have a job. So this is what all that Mashugana looks like in system dynamics. Okay, so there's molecule number 1 on the right. Right, so if we zoom back here, right there, equation 1, right? You got to go back and look at the slide for the template for a linear model. You know, it would be DS1 dt equals A1 times S1 plus A2 times S2 plus ... and then B1 times U1 and all that. Remember? Well, if all the other stuff goes away except the first stock, instead of S1, we're calling it L, right? Molecule number 1. There it is on the right, the labor supply. I didn't call it L, I call it the labor supply. Natural growth rate, that's little n, right? Inside of output, that's your Leontief production function. So the labor output ratio and the capital output ratio, that's U and V, right? So that's this guy here, number 2, right? Capital and labor and V and U make output. So output has capital, labor output ratio, capital output ratio, V and U, right? APS is the little s, that's the thriftiness parameter. And S divided by V is the warranted growth rate, G sub W, special ratio of those two magic parameters, right? And the actual growth rate, you should see that from, we did that last time, right? A stock divided by its net flow. There's only one flow here. It's an inflow. Right? Okay. So, and then when do you get the golden age? When the actual growth rate equals the natural growth rate equals the warranted growth rate. So if all of the parameters work out just right, you get this economic nirvana. And there it is. So all those are the same, and you see you get the exponential growth, steady state economic, heaven.
But that's not reality.
Well, Herod didn't say it was, right? He said there's a trend and a cycle. That's the trend. The blue line is the trend. And there's no cycle if you're in the golden age. There's no cycle. You don't get any, because the entrepreneurs are always confident that they're investing the right amount, so they don't change their behavior, right? Like in the expected order rates, if the next order that comes in meets your expectations, you're not going to change your mind, right? So the weird thing is, though, V is determined by technology. V sub R is what the managers believe, right? However they get there with other business-related data or whatever. N is set by biology, sociology, I don't know, the fertility coefficient. And the S is the thriftiness parameter, and that's just set by preferences. So there's no particular reason to believe that all of those parameters will have the exact values to give you the golden age. And notice in the model, there's no feedback from any of those. They're all constants, which means they're all exogenous. They're just numbers put in the model from the outside. There's no feedback to change them if you're not in the golden age, right? So in the simplest case, they just all have to be the exact right values. But if they are, you get the golden age.
What is APS in that last model?
That's little s, the average propensity to save, the thriftiness parameter. Okay, so then we give Herod credit for his two problems that are applied to all growth theory models to this day. The first is the existence problem, which basically says, okay, you've got a new theory of how the economy works. Does it have a golden age growth path? Is it even possible in your model? So that's the existence problem, Herod's existence problem. Does a golden age growth path exist? And of course, we said, we just showed that it does. And the second Herod problem is it stable or unstable? If the system gets shocked out of the steady state, and we were looking at shocks the other day, right? What happens when it processes the shock, right? We looked at situations where you go into steady state error. That's not good, right? Herod was claiming there's going to be a cycle, although he described it in words, and everybody's going, yeah, we don't really see a cycle. We see a razor's edge. If you get knocked off, you fall away, you never return. So that's the Herod's stability problem. So if we remember, the actual growth rate times the actual capital output ratio equals S equals in the golden age equals the warranted growth rate times the required capital output ratio. It must be the case that if you're in the golden age, actual equals warranted and required equals actual capital output, right? Makes sense? Now, Herod felt it. This is when he's going into his words now, that the response of entrepreneurs to this situation would be, if there was a shock, they would get perverse signals. Let me try and find, okay, so this is a better way to see it. They'd get perverse signals. So if we were in a situation where, so just follow the math here. So I don't know why I switched to capital G's here. No idea when I made this slide. Those should be small g's to be consistent with you. But anyway, so we're starting again, G sub A times the actual V equals S, right? Then we recall that the capital to output ratio is K over Y, and then the change in the capital output. So there's kind of a step skip there in number 2 here. G sub A times dK over dy equals, so we just make it changing, little v and little vr are changing, right? And then we note that the change in the capital stock in the third equation there is investment. Investment's the flow that changes the capital stock. And there must be an equivalent required amount of investment, okay, again, to preserve the equality. So this is kind of Herod's instead of the gobbledygook here. Here's what he was saying. If the actual growth rate were greater than the warranted growth rate, then I has to be less than what is required. Okay. And what if you're investing less than you are required or are supposed to do, what are you going to do? You're required to invest in your minds 10, you're investing 8.
You're not leveraging your assets.
What are you going to do?
You're also not protecting the labor force based on the theory.
None of that's real. You want 10, you're investing 8. You're going to invest more.
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Okay. But your growth rate is faster than you want it to be to begin with. So in other words, if the system is somehow knocked away from its steady state growth path, some shock undefined hits it, it will never return. It will in fact move farther and farther away. Okay, because the entrepreneurs are getting the wrong signal. They're going to invest more, but their growth rate is bigger than it should be. Well, why would you invest more and speed things up if G sub A is already bigger than G sub W? Okay, that gives you the razor's edge. All right, now Herod was tearing his hair out trying to say, well, that's not what I'm saying. And he wrote additional papers, a book on the subject, and so forth. And really what he was saying, and he fleshed this out in later papers and things, was really what we're talking about is entrepreneurial expectations. So the entrepreneurs are expecting the wrong rate of economic growth, so they invest the wrong amount. Okay, and that is either going to give you a cycle or this razor's edge thing, but that's the problem. Now, Hywell Jones wrote a book that I used as a graduate student, which I absolutely loved. It was one of my favorite books in all of economics. And Hywell Jones was a fellow Oxford economics professor and a buddy of Sir Roy Herod. And Hywell Jones took his Oxford lectures to Oxford students studying for the economics tripos, and he wrote all his lectures up into this book. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. It explains all this complicated stuff really, really, really well. So it was one of my favorite books. And I always remembered this quote in the book. It said, his buddy Herod's most important contribution wasn't the knife edge or Keynes's biography, but it was his emphasis on the role of entrepreneurial expectations as a central source of difficulty for the attainment of full employment, steady state growth. So Herod really was one of the first people to bring expectations of the future explicitly into economics. Keynes kind of was talking about animal spirits if you get pessimistic and whatever. So he was kind of talking about that. So Hywell Jones is saying, hey, cut my guy some slack here. He helped bring expectations into macroeconomics, which is a fundamental thing these days. Okay. So as you see here, the importance of expectations in economics, searching the web of science, you can see over time it's grown a great deal. Okay, so I'm remembering this from my student days, this book, and I loved it, so a book you love, you remember all the stuff in it, or most of the stuff, right? So then I get a paper from my good buddy, John Sterman. So do you know who John Sterman is? Suzanne does. Okay, so Big John is, at the time, I don't know if he is anymore, but at the time he was an editor of a journal, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. It's a pretty good journal. And he asked me to referee the paper. So you've probably heard of the peer review process in academics, right? Where you invent something in your field, you discover something in your field, and you write it up into a paper for a scholarly journal for your fellow professors of whatever you're into. But before they publish it, they send it out anonymously for refereeing, or for, they want others to read what you've done and see if there are any mistakes, any improvements, and what have you, right? And your name is removed. I mean, today with electronic documents, you just get the document without any identification in it. But in the old days, they literally would send you the paper and the editor would take a scissors or a razor and cut out your name and stuff anywhere it appeared, they like redacted it, So the author doesn't know the referees and the referees don't know the author. And they say, the editor says, tell me what you think. Should we publish this thing? Are there any errors, any improvements, whatever? So John sends me this paper, and the premise of the paper was, or the question the paper tried to answer, who's better at forecasting agricultural prices in the United States, the futures market, or somebody named Glenn Grimes? So Glenn Grimes at the time was an agricultural professor at the University of Missouri, so kind of close to Suzanne, a little bit, not right next door, but in that neck of the woods. And he was America's foremost agricultural product forecast guy. And he had like a radio show that all the farmers listened to, and a newsletter. I don't know if he had a TV show in that era, but he was, among farmers, agribusiness, he was the man. He really was good at forecasting where these commodity prices were going. Now think about it. If you're a farmer and let's say you're raising hogs, what's your decision? What's the price of pork going to be when my piglets are ready for market? And how many do I send to market? And how many do I hold back for making more piglets? If I expect the price of pork to be higher later in the future, then I'll hold more back, right? And then I'm also forecasting feed price and all that stuff, right? So getting a handle on, now this is why we have futures markets, by the way, so you can lock in a price for your corn or your wheat or your hogs or whatever. And if you're on the other side of the market, if you're the Kellogg's and you're buying corn for cornflakes, you'd also like to know what it's going to cost you. So the futures market, so the futures market is good at, like, it sort of crowdsources the price of these commodities, but then you got this guy who's like really good at it. So who does a better job? That was the question the paper asked, right? And so I refereed the paper, and I noted that, wait a minute here, I think I have actual data. And in fact, sorry, but if I go back, can you see my spreadsheet?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the appendix of this article I refereed for John, I had, look at this, the actual hog prices and the forecasted hog prices from Glenn Grimes. He also had it for cattle. And it's funny, John has a similar thing in his book, but we never collaborated. And I never told him I did this, and he never told me he was putting it in his book. And we did kind of the same thing. A little bit of the same thing, not a lot of the same thing. But he happened to pick the cattle prices, and I happened to pick the hog prices. Like I said, we never collaborated or talked about it. But here's the actual data from the appendix of the paper. And I said, I now have data on a person's expectation of the future in my field of economics. Happens to be hog prices. I'm not an agricultural economist, but whatever, I'll take what I can get. And then I remembered my buddies, Roy Herod, right? And let me put this around a little bit here. I remembered all Sir Roy, and one of my favorite econ books, where Hywel Jones is telling us, hey, Sir Roy brought expectations into economics, or was one of the people made it, emphasized it, and like it's a big deal. And there's this knife edge thing. So I started thinking, I wonder if I can help out old Roy Herod with some system dynamics. All right. So remember when we had the expected order rate, right? We did that. And we basically had this, this structure. I have these, hang on here. Somewhere we got tools. Let's do this instead. Once again, I'm assuming you're seeing my screen.
Mm-hmm. I can see it.
So, oh, let me go over it. So over here, not this. So right there, that's the expected order rate, molecule number 3 from our homework exercise and from the arms race model I did. Remember that? Right? Perceived arms from the other side that they have, right? So it's okay as a, but that, when we put a, for actual, this is hog price, but for actual order rate, when we put a ramp function in there, what did we get? Steady state error, right? No good. So I said, let me build a structure here. And there's, Jim Linus has some stuff in his book. John Sturman has some stuff in his book. I didn't just invent this out of thin air, but I sort of twisted and turned it to fit my situation. But I said, let's build a structure, an expectation structure that goes beyond that third molecule. And let's say that the third molecule is a perception molecule, not an expectation of the future molecule. Okay. So that's what's going on over here. Because I wanted to draw here, but it's kind of hard to, right? Okay, now this is generic. There's just an input, right? Now, remember we mentioned Kahneman and Tversky last week, right? So, well, let me just, before I get to Kahneman and Tversky, let me say, if you take my structure and you use a ramp function on it now, 1 and 2, now 2 used to be expectations, but now it's perceptions. So 2 is just over here, right? But before that was expected order rate. Now it would be perceived order rate, right? And you can see I got the railroad tracks again with respect to the ramp. But look at number 3. Now that's the expected input. That's down over here, right? And now it's doing the right thing. Like, remember we said, if every week you get 20 more coming in for 1 billion weeks, at some point you're going to begin to expect that. Even if after the billion and first week, it's not 20 more, you would still rationally expect it to be 20 more, right? And with the railroad tracks, it never happens, right? But with this structure here, with this fix, remember we said we could fix steady state error. We fixed it with the horizontal railroad tracks. It was a fix. So here's a fix. And we get rid of the railroad tracks. So the blue line event, now we can make the blue line get up to the red line faster if we make the time constant smaller, right? But we can fix the problem. So it's mathematically sound. We got rid of the steady state error up here. The other thing now, Kahneman and Tversky. Yeah, but does it make any sense in the real world? And the answer is yes. So Kahneman and Tversky spent their entire careers trying to figure out what people do when they make their decisions in the face of uncertainty. Okay, so kind of their expectations or their forecasts, they just don't know. So one of the things they found out that people do is they anchor and adjust. So what that means is they focus on something with which they are familiar that's similar to the thing with which they are not familiar or uncertain about. And they try to fudge what they know about to fit what they don't know about. So, a classic example would be if you were shown a picture of a male figure standing in front of a white wall. So there are no visual cues like a car or a doorway or something to give you some idea as to how tall they are. And you say, how tall are they? So you're fundamentally uncertain about that. But what would you do? In that you have to give me a height. There's a picture of a male figure in front of a white wall. There are no other visual cues, but you have to give me your best guesstimate of how tall that person is. What might you do?
You mean you get that you have to have some frame of reference. You have to have a measuring tape, or you got to have something next to it to know how
There's
tall
nothing, but you got to give me a number.
I guess you would just think about like maybe what you think the average height is for a.
So you might say, well, the average height of a male in the United States is 5'9.5". My brother is 5'11". This guy looks a little shorter than my brother. I'll say 5'10". You anchor and adjust, right? The classic experiment that Kahneman and Tversky did was, I think it was called the Wheel of Fortune, and they had, I think it was Stanford undergraduates one by one come into a room. I think one was at Stanford, one was at Berkeley, so I don't know which university it was, but they would one by one come into a room, and there was like a table, a chair, and a graduate student running the experiment. And the person would sit down and they'd say, how many African nations are members of the United Nations? I think that was the question. They purposely selected a question like nobody's going to have any friggin' clue. And they had to give them a number. And they gave them a number and they said, thank you. Here's your $20 for participating in our experiment. Next kid comes in. How many African? So then the second group came in, same room, same table, same chair, same graduate student, but there was a roulette wheel there. Kid sits down, they spin the roulette wheel and da, 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 da. And then they said, how many African nations are members of the United Nations? The second group of answers were statistically significantly biased to whatever random number came up on the wheel. And now nobody just picked the number explicitly on the wheel, but they postulated that subconsciously, you need a number, you're under pressure. You didn't have like all day here. I don't know if they had time. I can't remember if they had time pressure or not, but you got to give me a number. And so, and you had no idea. So the mind sort of said, anchored on the 7 that came up and adjusted it to a 9 or something like that. Okay. So we anchor and adjust. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's a psychologist, for this and other similar work. Amos Tversky, they said the Nobel is not given posthumously. He had died from cancer prior to the Nobel, but they said in the citation that they would have given it to Tversky as well, co-recipients, if he were still alive. So this is an anchoring and adjustment mechanism as well. The anchor is the reference input. So the input is the thing you're maybe uncertain about. The perception is if it's moving around, you're forming an opinion about it. Then you're making an anchor reference point against which you can compare your opinion, your perception of the input. You're picking up on the trend and then using that to form a forecast of the future, an expectation of the future. So it's not the Wheel of Fortune, but there's an anchoring and adjustment mechanism in here. So you can interpret it in terms of psychology, because expectation formation is a psychological thing, and it's mathematically sound. So then I said, I have data on what Glenn Grimes expected hog prices to be. So I said, let's feed, no pun intended, the actual hog price. I just showed you the spreadsheet to this structure and have it kick out an expectation. And then let's, under the assumption that Glenn Grimes was looking at, you could look at other stuff, but that he was aware of what actual hog prices were. Let's see how we do. So first of all, this is what Grimes did or expected versus what actually happened. Okay, and you can see without statistical analysis that the red and the blue lines are kind of similar. He sometimes misses the turning point, which is when you're forecasting, you miss turning points. But overall, you would say, yeah, the red and the blue line move pretty similarly, right? And that's why he was America's foremost, agricultural, however he did it. But here's my model looking at the actual data versus what Glenn Grimes thought they would be. And I'm assuming he was looking at the actual data. He might have looked at other stuff. And you can see it does a very good job. It can be fit to the data quite nicely. And you can say, how do you find out time to perceive hog price, time horizon, we'd make it like 3, and then I'd turn the little wheel and it would go faster or slower. Well, here we're using data to find out what those parameters were. And it came out nicely, both for the perception of the hog prices and the perception of the trend, a perception concept. It was about half a quarter. But for the anchor, which should be moving, but very slowly, it was like 19 quarters, which made complete sense. Okay, so I said, there is some evidence that this contraption here can mimic human expectation formation. So now, Sir Roy Harrod, in all his writings, he's begging his fellow economists to listen to him. I'm not saying there's a knife edge. It's the entrepreneurs making mistakes, but there's a cycle. Okay. So let's take that Herod model and let's stick in this hog price thing, but let's not have it make expected hog price. Let's make it expected GDP,
Right.
which they're using to see. That's well, not expected, the expected growth rate in GDP, which would be the warranted growth rate, which is what they think based on their capital output requirements will be correct for the actual growth rate and the steady state growth path. So in Herod's later writings, he showed that if the expected growth rate was equal to the actual growth rate, the warranted growth rate, and the natural growth rate, you once again would have your golden age growth path. But that makes sense, right? If the entrepreneurs are expecting the correct growth rate, the actual capital output ratio and the required capital output ratio are going to be the same, and they'll invest the right amount, and everything will be fine. They won't change their behavior, and all is well. He claimed the problem was if the entrepreneurs make a mistake, if the system is shocked from the outside. So I said, what would happen if I shock this thing just one time from the outside and make them make a mistake in their expectations just once? What happens? So this is the steady state equilibrium thing. And look at there. You get the trend in the cycle, just like Sir Roy claimed. And then I said, can I fit it to data for the US economy? And I sure can. There's all the parameters. Okay. So what are my conclusions? Herod's intuition was correct. His model can explain the trend in the cycle. Managerial expectations are crucial to understanding economic dynamics, and the knife edge should be called into question, just like Herod said.
But the knife edge was never Herod's thing. It was his critics' thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it
because
should
he
be
was
called
talking
into
about
question. He
equilibrium.
said I never said it,
Yeah.
and it's not
Yeah.
right. And I'm saying what I did there support. Now, he didn't have system dynamics, and he could say, well, how would I know that that's how he would have modeled it, so you get into that game. But the point is, you can take his basic model and his arguments, and with system dynamics, right out of the system dynamics playbook, standard molecules and whatever. I mean, I didn't invent, I just use standard stuff, formulation. You haven't learned these yet, and guess what? Exactly what the guy said, So I wish I was, when he passed away, I was a sophomore in college. So I was studying economics and I heard of him, but he would not have admitted me into his rooms at Oxford probably at that point. They say he would have gotten the Nobel Prize, but they started giving it away in '69 in economics, and they had a giant backlog of famous guys, and they just didn't get to him by the time he died. So he would have won it as well, but he passed, just like Amos Tversky and the Black-Scholes options pricing model won the Nobel, but Fisher Black had died, so they said we would have given it to Fisher Black too. But these idiots, they just like, why say that? Just give it to him. He's dead, so you don't have to share the money. just say you got, no, we don't give it away, Anyway, so that's just a story from my world of economics. But you can see we have a fix for this steady state error thing, right?
Mhm.
And you can also interpret. You can do the PID stuff and just do derivative, integral, but like, what does it mean? But we have ways of interpreting in the real world what these aspects of it mean. Right. And you can tidy up some stuff. All right. So what time we got here? So we're moving right along. What an interesting story, Mike.
But, no, I mean, that it really is, because I can see, it makes me think people talk about conflicts or different positions on high stakes situations. If you can just get one party to change their perceptions or their expectations, you can impact the whole system. And I think your model structure demonstrates it's not really about the content, it's about the players and about how they're perceiving what's going on. And there's a lot of power in that. And that's sometimes a hard thing to get other people in the system to believe that. You know, it's about what we believe and about what we expect. And if we're willing to change those things
Yeah.
or not have such a stranglehold on them, you can change the system.
Well, I kind of felt bad for, like I said, I never met the guy, but, I kind of felt bad. I did present this thing at Oxford for the first time. I unveiled it there. But I felt bad for the guy. It's like, if I was a little older or you were a little younger, I could have helped you. I could have showed you this stuff and, but, our paths kind of didn't cross. But yeah, I don't know if you've ever been to Oxford or Cambridge over there, but we stayed when we were there, we stayed in the rooms as like you're an undergraduate, and ate in the dining hall and all that stuff. It is exactly like you're in a Harry Potter movie. God is my witness. The dining hall looks exactly like all of them do, but and the rooms look like, it's amazing how it's really neat going to those places and seeing all that stuff.
That's my costume for tomorrow.
What's that?
That's my Halloween costume for tomorrow. Harry Potter.
Oh, Harry Potter. Yeah. No, it's awesome. It's awesome. But the other thing I'm gonna, and with the next things that we do, I want you to develop the skill. Not that they're gonna use, when you're gonna be an SD person, you're not gonna be doing traditional math all the time, but you want to have the skill set of having a fighting chance when somebody starts doing traditional dynamic math and throwing it at you. Oh, you're a dynamic modeler, eh? And then up go the differential equations or something, that you have a fighting chance of interpreting what they're doing. Like in your mind, you're sort of you're translating from, French to English and redoing it in your mind in terms of system dynamics. And usually when you do that, the traditional math people don't think in terms of feedback loops. They don't know their models have feedback loops. And then you point that out and they're like, what do you mean? And then you show them, they're like, oh my God. So it's a good skill to have to a point. You can overdo it, but Forrester used to always joke, oh, we had some doctoral students from the electrical engineering department wander over here again, and they were confused about the dynamics of an electron cloud at the interface of whatever it was. And he said, well, we modeled it in system dynamics. Then they understood it. Then we sent them back to the electrical engineering department. So
that's pretty funny.
Oh, all right.
I've been listening to the American Prometheus book, about Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff you're talking about was during that era, and yet you could take it to another arena and it would be similar sort of problems and people's expectations and their perceptions and how it affected the way they did science. It was really quite interesting.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. All right. So up to this point, we've been looking at first order feedback loop systems, minor loop systems, positive and negative. We looked at really 3 molecules. And we looked at some of the traditional math, just so we're familiar where it's coming from, right? Even though we're not going to really do that traditional linear math stuff, we're at least aware. We're aware of what the computer does, and so forth, right? And we're starting to see that to build big models, you got to take these little models and test them and then hook them together and test some more. Now, there's other molecules in those 3, of course, but you get the basic, we're getting the idea of how you build one of these things. And also, I hope you're beginning to see whether it's like the Herod model in its traditional format, or somebody like Tim Clancy, if he shows us a model, let's get him in here, you'll begin to see these molecules, like in the arms race model, like, wow, we use that same one like 4 times, that you recognize this stuff, right? That it's not, you can do this. You've already seen a lot of this stuff and you begin to see how we build these things, right? So the next step in the story is, well, what's the next level of sophistication beyond a first order system, which would be 1 stock or 1 independent stock? That would be 2, a second order system. So now there's going to be 2 independent stocks. Okay. And the traditional presentation of this concept is, so bear with me here. Oscillation. Okay, so if a system is going to go up and down, or is going up and down, that means there's at least 2 stocks independent of one another. Okay, there can be more. And there is a major negative feedback loop. Okay, so it's seeking a goal. Okay, it just misses the goal. It over and undershoots its target. Okay, so. All right, so here we have an oscillating system. This poor guy, the water's too cold. Now he fiddles with, then we got stocks and flows here. Now it's too hot. Now it's too cold. Now it's too deep. And I'm hoping and praying that this poor guy is at a hotel, because if it's his own tub, it's like, dude, you don't know how to fill your own tub up. Yeah, weaving in and out of traffic is like, drive straight. Okay. So as I just suggested, you need at least 2 stocks, and those 2 stocks, the minimum of 2 stocks have to be part of a major negative feedback loop. So you have a goal-seeking process. But the corrective action, if there's a gap between what you want and what you got, the corrective action is delayed, and the delay causes the amount of corrective action to be too much or too little when it gets to the stock. So it over or under corrects. Okay. So what can be the source of delays around a negative loop? Well, here we talked about perceptions, right? Stocks create delays. So we made a perception. We use one of the molecules to make a perception element of that expectation structure. And it creates a delay. It takes a while to recognize something, to perceive something, right? Now you've perceived the state of the system, and you compare it to the desired state of the system. And if there's a gap or a discrepancy, now you got to do something about it. You've got to initiate corrective action, but there can be administrative and decision-making delays. Oh, we got to call a committee. We've got to get the Congress to pass a bill, right? Or we got to get the board of directors on board with this before we do whatever. Now the corrective action is initiated, but it takes some time to get it into practice. Okay, we're going to build that new facility. It's going to take 3.5 years to, get the permits, design it, build it, test it, and get it online, right? So by the time it arrives, it's no longer the right amount of corrective action. So here's a little example. Kind of seen stuff like this already, so not to belabor this, but again, it's production, sales, and inventory. You've seen that before. We've got some first order control up here. Here's the desired level of inventory. So we're going to correct any gap. But remember, we have to replace what we're losing. You've seen that all before, right? But here's how do we get the second stock in here? We want to do oscillation. Desired production given productivity means desired labor, because you need people to make the stuff. So we've got a minor negative loop here, and we've got a major negative loop here, right? Start in equilibrium and shock it out. And what do we get? We get the new higher level of output. So there's a shock, sales are suddenly booming. We use a step. The system reacts and starts to produce more to meet the new higher level of demand. But about Friday of week 2, what happens? The inflow of production matches the new higher level of sales, but we have to go above it because inventory has been drawn down below desired inventory. We've seen this structure somewhat before, right? Okay, so when the red line and the blue line are together right before week 2, the inventory stops falling, but to rebuild inventories, production has to go above the new higher level of sales. So you start rebuilding inventory. So around Tuesday of week 3, inventory is back at its desired level, But around Tuesday of week 3, now we're producing way more than we need. Now in this model, there's no undertime or overtime. So like if you have somebody in the labor force, they come to work every day and they make stuff. You can't tell them go home early, stop making stuff, because that's not the purpose of the model. So they keep producing inflow over outflow. So then, of course, inventory goes above its desired level, and well, you get the idea. The system is out of sync. Eventually, it figures it out. Okay. Now, if you're going to look at time shapes, sorry, we want to move this over here. We want to sometimes say something about a time shape. You know, it's a reference mode, right? We talk about doubling time and half-life, and it takes 3 time constants to get 95% of the way to a target. Well, with oscillation, there's similar sorts of things we can say, other than just say, oh, it's going up and down. We can zero in a little better on the type of oscillation that we have. So the period of the oscillation is the time between successive peaks or troughs, okay? And if you flip that over, 1 divided by the period, you get the cycles per unit of time. So how many times through the up, down, up do you get in a particular week, year, whatever the thing is measured in, okay? The amplitude is, if that confuses people. Everybody thinks it's the peak to the trough, but it's not. It's the mean to the height of the oscillation. And here's your period. Right. The damping ratio is kind of like, oh, it takes 3 time constants to get you 95% of the way to the first order negative loop, right? Well, the damping ratio is kind of like that, where you get the difference in successive amplitudes divided by the original amplitude, okay? And similarly, the settling time is, again, very similar to that concept. The time it takes for, you'll see the picture here, for the oscillating variable to get to 95% of its way to the new level, the new steady state. And then the rise time is the time it takes an oscillating variable to reach its steady state value for the first time if you use a step input. So these are, you know, I don't know, that I don't necessarily use these. Sometimes I use these. Depends on the context. But, you know, if somebody says, well, if you say it's going up and down, you say, can you be a little more precise? These are the sorts of things that you could measure if you had real data and say, okay, it's an oscillation that has these particular characteristics. Okay. So the natural frequency, I did show you an example of this when we were doing the characteristics of complex systems. I started a system in equilibrium and I knocked it out with noise, and it oscillated at the frequency that it wanted to, or at which it was designed to oscillate. Maybe not consciously designed, but that's given the stock flow feedback loop structure, it wants to oscillate at that frequency, okay? And that's its natural frequency. And you usually will find that out with noise, just the wiggling it a little bit somewhere, and it'll oscillate at its natural frequency. Feedback systems tend to amplify oscillations. Okay, so if you want to do chaos, you need at least 3 stocks for endogenous continuous time chaos, but you can get it in continuous time with 2 stocks if you're driving it from the outside with an exogenous oscillation. So that's another way to do it, because these systems tend to amplify oscillations. So let's look like some more molecules here, some more very simple little structures that teach us about some of these ideas. So what do we see here? Any thoughts on what we're seeing here on the screen?
I mean, it's a balancing loop with 2
Negative
stops.
loop.
Yeah.
Is it major or minor?
Major.
Okay, so it goes through more than one stock. So this is a
Right.
skill. A veteran system dynamicist is going to ask you, is it a major or minor loop you're telling me about? So you got to know what that means, right? Are there any minor loops?
No.
Okay. All right. So if we got this very simple situation, what do we have here? It's going to oscillate. Okay. And looky here. If we take time away and we graph one stock against the other one, you get a nice orbit. And usually the center of the orbit is called an attractor. And it's sort of like the sun would be the attractor and the planets orbiting around it. And that would be the equilibrium point. So if we'd spiral into the sun, we'd be.
So we take time away by plotting stock one against
Yeah,
stock.
well, in terms of the graph, it's still a dynamic system, but yeah, you plot one stock against another. Now, if you have a 7th order system, you've got to pick 2 stocks of the 7.
Hmm.
If you have a more sophisticated graphical capability, you can pick 3 stocks, X, Y, and Z plane. If you have, but we can't go beyond that. You can pick a maximum of 3, right? If you have the graphical capability. What do you see here?
I see a balancing loop with 2 stocks. So you have a major feedback loop, but then you also have 2 constants that are exogenous that are impacting the flow of your second stock.
So we have a major negative loop and we have a minor negative loop. So what do you think a minor negative loop would do
Okay, I see.
to a major? So intuition, system dynamics intuition, a major negative loop is probably going to do what?
Trump a minor one.
Well, but what time shape would a major negative loop typically give you?
An oscillation.
An oscillation. What would adding a minor negative loop likely do? Would it amplify it or dampen it?
It would amplify it.
What do you say, Ashley? Would it make the oscillations bigger or more frequent, or would it go the other
But it's
way?
a balancing loop too, so maybe it will dampen it.
I think it
Sorry,
would
go ahead.
dampen it because it would be controlling the one factor, so it doesn't have as much of an effect.
Mhm. It dampens it, yeah.
Dampens it.
Okay.
So what do we learn from that for policy? If you have something that's oscillating and you want to make it stop, like your heartbeat. No, wait, that has to oscillate. Not everything that's oscillating should be stopped from oscillating. But
That's
if you want to
good.
make it
That's good
an
advice.
oscillating thing stop oscillating, one thing you might consider doing is changing the design of the airplane, adding a minor negative loop somewhere in the system. Depends on where you add it. And if you go and graph one stock against the other, now you get a spiral to the equilibrium. Okay. Now what do you see?
You have a negative major loop with a minor positive loop.
And what does your intuition say that might do?
I think it's going to make the oscillations have more amplitude.
Mhm.
That's exactly right. So you're going to give it more juice and the spiral is going to be outward now. Okay. Now here, there's no limiting factor, so it's going to just keep growing theoretically forever. But these models are very, very simple. So they're just sort of priming the pump for, your intuition. Now what do we got?
Now we have a balancing major loop. And we have one minor balancing loop and then one minor reinforcing loop. So in theory, they would cancel each other out and you would be back to oscillations based on your.
Yeah,
major-
it really depends on the size of those parameters, the weight or
Right.
let's say the gain given to
Right.
each of the loops, because the stronger
Right.
loops are going to win. So it depends on how you model it, but it's still going to oscillate, but they're going to change the character of the oscillation, and it depends on how you set it up. So in this case, it rotates the orbit and stretches out the periodicity. Now,
Yeah, I might be able to get this.
there's not one answer here. It depends on how you set it up, but the point is it's still going to oscillate, but those minor loops can change the characteristic of the oscillation, right? Okay, so in this case, we showed the following. This is just recapping what we just saw, right? But it depends on the polarities, right? And how strong those parameters are, how big those parameters are. So positive loops can stretch out the period, as we saw, bigger, and then they can also increase the amplitude, as we saw. Okay, so that you got that's just good to know, right? I'm not saying you necessarily want to do that when you're redesigning an airplane, but you got to know, if you were to do that, what is it going to do?
Mhm.
These are more advanced entrainment. What else we got here? Limit cycles. This one here, I mentioned there were no limits. No floors and ceilings, right? So these models that we're showing here are linear models. Even though they're second order, they're linear. Linear models can generate all different kinds of time shapes. Okay, but we would say, it doesn't make sense that this thing would oscillate bigger and bigger forever. So that takes us to the notion of limit cycles. So as soon as you introduce floors and ceilings, which would make sense that it can't go bigger than this or less than that, then we're introducing nonlinear relationships that say, look, when we're headed to the ceiling or headed to the floor, what does it do? Does it just smash its head into the ceiling and abruptly go the other way? Or is there more of a gradual adaptation to the limits? Okay. And so the classic example of that's a limit cycle. So you have the exploding oscillation, but then it starts hitting its floors and ceilings, and then it becomes a sustained oscillator. But in this case, it's a sustained oscillator that's nonlinear, whereas way back here, we had a sustained oscillator that's linear. So just because it's a sustained oscillator doesn't mean it's linear or nonlinear. Either way, you wish it was easier than that, but it's not. Okay. But, so anytime you see this, one of two things is going to happen. The thing is going to kill itself. So the airplane wing is vibrating, going like this, and then it tears off, or the machine is vibrating and it shakes it off of its foundations. Or it's going to hit its limits and then just start bouncing back and forth between the floor and the ceiling. So it'll either kill itself or find its limiting factors. These are not theorems that hold in all cases. They're rules of thumb, heuristics, guidelines, or whatever. Okay. Entrainment. So entrainment is kind of an interesting idea. The entrainment happens when you have systems that oscillate and they can interact with one another. So the classic example is clocks in a clock shop that have pendulum clocks. And so the proprietor comes in the morning and starts all the pendulums on each clock going, get them going. Some of them might be going overnight, but get them all going. And he starts them at different times. And at the end of the day, they're all swinging together. Their oscillations are entrained. Or pinyon pine trees. They have a very sweet nut. They're down in the Carolinas. And if every year they drop their nuts, the squirrels and all the critters eat them and the tree can't reproduce. So what the pinyon pine does, it stores up its nuts for a whole bunch of seasons and then drops them. And then there's so much, the animals can eat all they want. There's still acorns or whatever the hell they are, the pine cones, whatever, seeds to reproduce the tree. But the thing is, all the pinyon pines do it together. Or fireflies, they come out at night and their oscillations are like this. End of the night, they're entrained. So, and Forrester is postulated, and Alan Graham, one of his doctoral students, that like the business cycle is really individual firms have cycles, but they entrain. So you got to have communication somehow. Like in the clock case, it's probably vibrations on the wall. With the fireflies, there's probably some scent they send out or whatever, and the pinyon pines probably have some kind of scent or something they send out. Forrester used to tell us that in the old days before atomic clocks at the National Bureau of Standards, where they kept the time, I think that's where it is, they used to dig down to the bedrock and implant very high quality pendulum clocks at 90 degrees to one another in the bedrock so that the pendulums wouldn't entrain. And then they would take the average of the time on all whatever 5 clocks or whatever it is to make the official time for the country. Now, Erik Mosekilde, a very well-known Danish physicist who did system dynamics, and I spent about a month in his physics laboratory in Denmark, even though I'm nowhere near a physicist. He invited me there. It was a lot of fun. It was really neat watching how the Danes do science and whatever. But what he was telling me was he even though he was a physicist and did system dynamics, his research was working with physicians and veterinarians on human and animal systems, body systems. And so what he would do would be like, he'd take like a sheep's kidney, sheep's renal system, I guess. I'm trying to remember what he was telling me. And they would inject a drug and see if they could predict from a system dynamics model of the sheep's renal system what the drug was going to do, that kind of thing. And with human systems, he used to pay graduate students to lie in a hospital bed for like 48 hours and just not move, just sit there, read, watch TV or whatever. And then every like half hour, somebody would come in and take a sample of something he was measuring. Some blood thing or blood pressure, cholesterol, whatever the hell it was. Because his theory was that all of the systems in the mammals' bodies oscillate. That if somebody says to you, what's your cholesterol? And you give them a number, then I said, well, he says, that's at a moment in time when it was measured. What's your blood pressure? You know, well, whatever number you gave or numbers, it was that at that moment in time that it was measured. But he said it's really, they're oscillating systems. So he would take these measurements on his students and then plot them. And they're all oscillations. And he also believed, his theory was that all of the oscillating systems in the human body and the animal body have to be chaotic, because the only oscillations that cannot entrain are chaotic signals. Because he said otherwise what would happen is all the oscillations and all the systems in the body would be going up and down together. When they were down, you'd be laying there, you couldn't get up, and then they all go up and you'd be like all crazy. So he said for balance and harmony, they have to be chaotic signals so that they don't entrain. So he was trying to model that, you know, getting samples, data samples, and then build system dynamics models and whatever. He's a very smart guy. And I haven't seen him in years. I used to send him a Christmas card and he'd send back one of his reprint of one of his papers. Merry Christmas. Here's a paper to read. Give me homework. So, but he was a good guy. It was fun being in his physics laboratory. Because like every day at I think I was trying to remember now. It was a while ago. It was 3 o'clock. All stop, and the physicist. It was at the what the hell was it called? I can't remember what it's called. The Danish Technological University. I can't remember what they called it, but they had different physics buildings. It wasn't all physicists were not herded into just one building. And what would happen is every day at 3 o'clock, everybody would stop what they were doing and they would all gather in this one building in like around this conference table, and there was always bread and butter and tea and coffee. And you would go and you would talk for like 15 minutes. It wasn't a long break. You'd have some tea and a slice of bread and butter and meet your colleagues. And it was religious. No one ever missed it. He said, this is very important that you're in different buildings doing different things, but every day for 15 minutes, we all get together. We have butter, bread, and tea. I thought, well, that's kind of fun. You know, it wasn't like a big deal. It didn't last all that long, but you know, you barely swallowed your bread and drank your tea and it was over. But that was kind of like a neat thing to do. So, all right. Anyway, let's see.
It is a known phenomenon that animals' reproductive cycles, even women's menstrual cycles, if you spend a lot of time together, they will entrain.
Yeah, that's another example. Yeah. So yeah, it's like everywhere. When you're sensitive to this stuff, it's like, yeah, now that you mention it, you know, we see this stuff, you know, all around us when we're
Mhm.
paying attention to it. Let me just get my cursor always disappears here. Hang on. There we go. It disappears and appears. All right. So here's a limit cycle. The oscillation grows, then it hits its orbit. I mentioned chaos, and I didn't have what time is it? 7:04 now. We're running out of time. I was going to get a nice example from another slideshow. I might be able to do it. I should have put it into this slide deck. I didn't. And I was thinking about doing it, never got there today. But so it's this chaos thing. So what is chaos? The periodicity, the period of, you know, peak to peak, trough to trough, is essentially infinite because it never repeats. The oscillation pattern never repeats ever to infinity. So that the ordered pairs that are being plotted, the numbers, they will pass most statistical tests for randomness, the random numbers, even though they're coming from a deterministic model. There's no noise in the model. Okay, so that's seen as a weird thing with chaos. And then there's the butterfly effect. Now, there's a movie starring Ashton Kutcher by that name, but the butterfly effect in chaos is often said that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas. Okay, and that means that these chaotic systems are highly sensitive to their initial conditions. And I'll see if I think we'll have enough time. I'll pull something up and I'll show you an example of that. Before we do that, let's look at the most famous chaotic model, and it's the one that the model that confuses people about what the butterfly effect is. So these are the Lorenz equations. So right out of the box, if you would see this, what would your system dynamics intuition tell you?
Linear model.
So first of all, it's nonlinear.
Non-linear.
And how do we know that? Am I missing I'm missing a, look, shame on me. Everything just, what the heck? Why did everything disappear like that? I got to get back here. I need a parentheses here. All right. Back we go. I gotta better save that. All right. So it's nonlinear. How do we know that? Because look at the second equation, X times Z. When you multiply two stocks together, nonlinearity, right?
Oh, yeah.
So anytime you see dx dt, dy dt, dz dt, d something dt, those are flow equations. So you have three flow equations here. So the flow dx dt is flowing to what stock? What's the name of the stock it's going to?
Why? Dx dt, is that the one you're asking?
Yeah, and it's a flow. Where is it flowing? To a stock. It has to flow to a stock. What stock?
X.
X, the stock called X, because that's the change in the stock X over time. Dy dt, whatever all that stuff is, it's a flow. Where is it flowing? To the stock named Y. Same thing with Z. Okay. So these flow equations are going to have parameters in them, sigma, R, B, and they're going to have stocks in them in these flow equations, right? Now, the guy who did the Lorentz equations, Ed Lorenz, was a meteorology professor at MIT, and he was making a little weather system here. So sigma represents the Prandtl number, whatever that is, the ratio of the fluid viscosity of a substance to its thermal conductivity. No idea, not my area, okay? The variable R represents the difference in temperature between the top and bottom of the gaseous system. So I think he was modeling like the global weather system with three equations, right? The variable B is the width to height ratio of the box, which is being used to hold the gas. So that would be like the atmosphere, okay? And then it's a rotation and all this. It's weather stuff. I don't know what it is, but there it is in system dynamics. So if these were economics things, I would have a much better grasp of what's going on here. But clearly there's feedback loops. And, you know, that is like, oh my God. But, you know, we have a fighting chance here to figure out what's going on if you cared. Right, because it's a meteorological thing. It's, you know, for most of us, it's not our bag. But here's just, if you plot just the stock Y, and I did it from 848 to 890 periods of time. The time, we're not saying what time means. Okay, kind of looks like it's repeating, but it's not. And that is if you graph Z against X. Remember how you can pick two stocks and graph them against one another? You know, and that's what people think is the butterfly effect. That's the Lorentz attractor. It's a strange attractor. And remember, we got three equations, three stocks. It's a third order system. We have X and Y, but then we have Z. There's a depth to it, right? And you can't see it. So if these lines, if any of these lines here would touch, these orbits would touch, then the oscillation would repeat. But in the Y direction, which is going that way, it's like this. It looks like my hands are touching, but they're not. And if you go this way, they're not touching.
Right.
That's the third dimension. So it never repeats. So this is not the butterfly effect, but it looks like a butterfly. And of course, if you, oh, it's on my laptop. It's on my other computer. The screensaver on my other computer is the Lorentz attractor, but in 3 dimensions. So you can see it. I forgot it was my other computer. Yeah, this is the Dell thing. That's the default thing. Okay. So the Lorentz attractor, very famous. And if you have better graphical software with multiple colors and stuff, you can make it look really cool. But I just did it in Stella. So let's look at another oscillatory system and talk. Well, you know what? I'm looking at my clock here. Let's not do Loc de Volterra today. We'll do that next time. Let me pull up let me show you the butterfly effect. Let me fish around and get it from another PowerPoint slide because I think it's kind of neat. But before we do that, this is the teaser for next week. Loc de Volterra. What do you see there? Loc de Volterra is a very famous model. It's predator-prey. It's, you know, coyotes versus rabbits or whatever in an ecosystem. This model came out in like 1926 or something. So what do you see? This is from Wikipedia. What do you see here? Just real quick before we go over to the butterfly effect.
It is nonlinear.
How do you know that? That's correct.
Dx dt, dy dt.
Yeah, those are flows.
And also the way the equation's set up with the parentheses.
So if you would multiply an equation dx dt through by x, it would be alpha times x minus beta times x times y, and x and y are stocks. So as soon as you multiply two stocks together, you break the linear pattern, right? And it's nonlinear, right? And if it's predator prey, the predator and the prey have to interact with one another, right? So it's a nonlinear model. It's a second order system. There's two independent stocks. There's a stock called X and a stock called Y. X is the number of prey and Y is the number of predators, right? And these are the equations that show how the rabbits and foxes change over time and they interact. Okay. So next time we're going to look at how you would model this in system dynamics and make it, you know, this thing here to me is we modeled it. I mean, here it is. I modeled it in system dynamics, but it's not terribly transparent to me, right? If I put in Prandtl number or something, who cares? It doesn't, but I'll show you how we can take this other thing here and make this very easy and understandable. Okay. All right, but we're running out of time tonight. So let me find, I want to show you this butterfly effect, which is worth knowing about. And it has a lot of kind of neat implications. And chaos theory used to be like a really, really, really big deal. And it's less so these days, but it's still a pretty cool thing to talk about. Just bear with me here. Problem is I teach so many different versions of this class that where I stuff things, sometimes it is not clear to me. It's like, what did I do with them? All right, so hopefully you can see that. Chaos and Badarian Harris's Ricardian model. You see that? Yeah, you see, oh, okay, good. All right, so Luigi Passanetti just died. He's one of my favorite economists. Quick story about Luigi Passanetti. He's the guy on the far left. When I took my doctoral comprehensive exams, which back then they spanned 3 days, and in my field of economics, one day it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So Monday was micro, Wednesday was your field, and Friday was macro, as I remember it. And all you knew was micro was about micro, macro was about macro, and your field was about your field. My case, it was public sector economics. That's all you knew. That's all they told you. And in that era, you had to write on these weird pieces of paper that had that purple carbon paper. Suzanne will remember this. Ashley, you won't. But they used to make copies of stuff. They used to have sheets of paper and layer them with this carbon paper, which is this purple, disgusting
Messy,
paper.
ugly
And
stuff
if
that
you
got
had like
all
sweaty
over your
hands or something, you touch it, you get this purple stuff everywhere. And so to make 3 copies of whatever you were writing, you had to write on these special pieces of paper with this carbon paper in between, and because there were 3 readers for your exam. And it was the dead of summer, so you're nervous, you're sweating, and you're sticking to the stuff, and the purple's getting everywhere. And you had to put your number. You had a number that you put on your exam. You didn't want to know your name. And then they had somebody, a proctor, it was in a conference room, walking around the table every day for 3 hours, then for 6 hours, and for 3 hours. This person was circling you the entire time you were taking the test. So on the macro test on the last day, one of the 3 questions was reproduce Kaldor's economic growth model and discuss it, whatever, which I knew backwards, forwards, and upside down. And I hit a blank where all I could see was white nothing in my mind. And I knew it. I could recite it backwards in Arabic if I had to. And I couldn't, to save my life, remember it. I drew a panic blank or something. I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? So what did I do? I remembered Luigi Passanetti right there on the left was Caldor's student. And he noticed that his professor Caldor made a mistake, a logical slip, he called it, in his model. So he redid the Caldor model, got all the same results, but corrected the problem. And it's really famous in economics, and it generated the Passanetti theorem. It's a way more difficult model, but I remembered it. So I write on my doctoral exam, I'm not going to give you the Caldor model that had a logical slip in it. I'll give you the corrected version. I'll give you Passanetti's model. So I threw that down and I passed with distinction. Little did they know I was like panicking. So Luigi Passanetti has a special place in my heart. So he's at the
He
table on the left.
saved you.
Yeah,
He saved you.
yeah, he did. He died. He died just this year. He was like 98 or something. Don Harris is one of the two people who did this model, along with Amit Bhattacharya next to him, and then Duncan Foley's on the right. Who's Don Harris's daughter? Don Harris is a famous economist.
I don't know.
I'll give you a hint. She's the vice president of the United States.
Oh,
Interesting. That's
Pam-
cool.
It's her dad.
Kamala Harris.
He's a good guy, good economist. All right,
It's her father?
Yeah.
Okay.
Stanford economist. Yeah. All right. So they don't worry about the econ. It's a bunch of econ stuff, but they're going to build this model in discrete time, looking at David Ricardo's stuff. Okay, and here it is after I translated it into system dynamics. Okay, now they're doing chaos in discrete time, which is different. We work in continuous time in system dynamics, right? We make DT really small. We can't make it infinitesimally small, so we're still using technically discrete time, but we're approximating the continuous time. We're not doing 1, 2, 3, 4 difference equations, right? These guys are doing the difference equations, 1, 2. So a lot of stuff changes when you're doing discrete time modeling, but you can, with cleverness, make system dynamics software do it. Okay, so I'm making Stella do difference equation modeling, even though it's supposed to do differential equation modeling. So you don't need to know who David Ricardo was and what's going on here, but it's all this stuff here. They're taking you through their model, and here it is. Okay, and see that there's a little parameter little a there. Okay, and that's the key to this whole thing. So if you make a 2.95 in their model, now see it's discrete time. You can see it's a damped oscillation, right? If you make it 3.15, only change, now you have a limit cycle and it's a sustained oscillation.
Mm-hmm.
If you make it 3.5, you got a period 4 oscillation. If you make it 3.6, you get multi-period. 3.65, more complicated. And you get chaos when you hit 4. Okay. And you can even vary A and show, this is called a bifurcation plot. Again, Stella's graphical capabilities are really crappy, but if you look online and you see this, there's very beautiful, it's like artistic work when these things are really, if you have a refined plotting program, it's really neat. It's like mathematical art, but you can reproduce it. So we got a model that can behave chaotically. So let me show you the sensitive dependence on initial condition stuff, the butterfly effect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is what we would call a synthetic data experiment in system dynamics. So on the left is Harris and Bhattacharya's model of David Ricardo's musings from back in the day. Okay. Then I made an exact copy of it. I selected it and pasted it right next to it. And I'm calling the exact copy the model of the real world. So the one on the left is now the real world, and the one on the right is a model of the real world. And it's a pretty good model because it's an exact copy. It's a digital twin, to use modern terminology, right? Okay. The only difference is, you see where it says epsilon up there.
Yeah,
What I did is, with the butterfly effect, you change the initial value of a stock. Now the stocks
Right.
are kind of hidden in there because I'm doing gymnastics here to make it do discrete time modeling. You change the initial value of one stock by epsilon, where epsilon's a really, really, really small number, like 0.00001. Ever so slightly. Everything else is identical. You have perfectly identified and modeled the structure of the entire system. You have perfectly estimated every parameter in the system, right? The only thing is, the initial value of one of the stocks is off by epsilon, which is a really, really, really small number. Now, if it's a non-chaotic system, that matters absolutely not at all. Your model will predict perfectly. But what if it's chaotic? And you can see there that initially the model, in the initial, when you
few cycles,
started
yeah.
out, it can
Mhm.
predict it. But then very shortly, the perfectly specified model, except for one stock being off by epsilon, can't predict it. That's the butterfly, the sensitive
Change
dependence on
behavior.
initial conditions effect. So why do we care? Well, let's take economics, my field. If economic data, let's say the stock market, the futures market, currency markets, if they certainly oscillate. If they oscillate chaotically, the idea that you could predict them is impossible. Even if you had a perfect model, except for one thing was off by this, you can't predict it. Unless you're, doing microsecond trading, I suppose you could, but in principle. But so the idea that you're trying to build ever more sophisticated models to predict these systems is stupid. Now, if it's not chaotic, then it's a different story. Okay. So that's some of the interest in chaos. And I mentioned Eric Mosakild's idea about chaotic systems not being able to entrain. One last thing I'll leave you with. So there's the question of, our real life systems, do they behave, that oscillate, do they behave chaotically or not? And the traditional way of trying to figure that out is to get the data, the measurements, like the price of a futures contract or the dollar-euro currency pair, minute by minute, second by second on the markets. You're going to have a ton of data. And then there's all sorts of very clever, highly mathematical, statistical tests that have been devised to try and see if, statistically speaking, the actual system is behaving chaotically. Okay. And, you need a lot of data. And again, it's smart people, but there's Kolmogorov exponents and all sorts of crazy stuff that you have to estimate. And, that's okay, I guess. But Sterman took a different tack. So Sterman facilitates we did the beer game. I showed you the beer game, right? I sent you the link to the NPR or the McLaughlin report or whatever it was, McLaughlin report, 2 parts thing on the beer game. Remember I sent you guys that? I don't know if you watched it, but you see a very young John Sterman facilitating the beer
I've
game.
seen it before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
They did that right before I took all of John's classes, and they did that in the same room I had. That's what you look like. That's what the class looked like. That's where I learned system dynamics, exactly like that. But at any rate, so the beer game, all these people play it constantly. Thousands of people have played it, and you might have seen in the film, the video, where that on the walls, people were looking at all the plays of the game. They graphed their play, and then they looked at other people who played the game, right? And they had the record sheets. They were recording all their decisions, right? And John saved all those record sheets throughout the one. Some people screw it up. They move their pennies wrong, and they get it all wrong, and the data are useless. But ones who had legit data, he saved. And then he said, all right, let me build a system dynamics model of what is pretty much self-evident somebody would do at their position in the beer game. Remember, you're running beer inventory, right? And you've got orders coming in from your customer, and you got to move the pennies based on the orders, you know? So you got an order rate coming in. And when you need beer, you have to order from your supplier, right? And there's a delay before you get it. So what he said, what would somebody ideally do? They would watch the orders that are coming in and form an expectation or a trend or something based on what they see coming in. They would look down and see how many cases of beer they had, and they would think about how many they'd like to have in inventory. A lot of people pick 12 because that's what traditionally the game starts. So they'd say, well, I should have 12 because that's when I sat down there were 12. Or somebody might say, I have a better idea. I want 17 or 95 or whatever, it doesn't matter. But they would look down and say, not only is the incoming orders important, but how many cases of beer do I have and how many would I like to have? That's important to my decisions as to how much beer to order. And then the supply line. How much beer have I already ordered but isn't here yet? I got to take that into account. When I make my order, yeah, I got orders coming in and I don't got enough in inventory, but I got to remember I also have already ordered this and it's not here yet, right? And Johnson that makes sense, right? That's more or less what you do, right? So he built the system dynamics model, then he fitted to the data for each person who played the game, where he had legit data. And then he ran the model with the estimated parameters for that person, John's, Sally's, Fred's, Betty's, play of the game. And it was really cool. Some people played with a damp oscillation. They controlled their inventory very quickly. Other people had sustained oscillators, other people had exploding oscillators, and some people had chaos. And so he showed that chaos existed in the real world without trying to torture a data set some, right? So I thought that was wicked clever way of finding out, does the real world have chaos in it? And by the way, when people play the beer game poorly, what are the two biggest culprits? It's not the second thing I mentioned. Here's what I got in inventory, here's what I want. The biggest culprit is the supply line. They forget they've already ordered 55 of them or whatever. It's just not here yet. They look down and they're not here yet. So now, if you ask them, do you realize you've already ordered some, it's not here yet? They would say yes, but they're not taking that into account. Like, how many have I ordered? Not just last period, but there's multi-periods here. How many total have I already ordered? So they over-order, right? And then they have to correct the other way and they way under order. So you get the big swing. And the other was they overreact to the shock. And so some people are very hyper and they're like, oh my God, and they overreact. So that's the second biggest culprit. But the main one is forgetting the supply line. And John correctly says, think about it. That's like you go to the elevator and press the button to order the elevator car. Instead of ordering beer, you're ordering the elevator car. And what happens? The elevator doesn't come instantly. Sometimes it's just sitting there and the door is just open. But 99 times out of 100, it's on a different floor. So you're waiting there. Nowadays, people look at their phone. What does somebody invariably do?
Punch it again.
Punch it again. Reorder it. Well, the elevator system cancels the redundant order. It knows it's been ordered and the car's coming, right? But that's like, I want it and it's not here yet, so I'll order it again. It's like, why you order it? It's already been ordered. He said, or John would say, you go to a restaurant and you order drinks and a meal. And the waiter goes away, brings you your drinks, and then you tell the waiter, I want to order my meal. He looks at you and says, you already ordered your meal, your steak or whatever. It's being prepared. Well, you wouldn't do that because you remember you've already ordered the steak. It's just not, there's a delay before you get it here. You wouldn't reorder it. But people do that in the beer game. They order more than they need because they forgot or they don't take into account what they've already ordered. And a lot of times that can lead to chaotic oscillations.
And I believe that one of the rules on that is you're not allowed to talk to anybody that's a supplier or up or
You
down.
can talk to them, just not about what your decisions are.
Yeah,
So that makes it fun too, because you give the guy next to you a hard time. You're screwing me. What are you doing?
right.
And all that.
I think we didn't allow any talking when we facilitated.
Oh,
that.
everybody facilitates a difference. I've seen people, honest to God, they put up cardboard partitions between people with little doors cut in, so you got to slide the pen, so you can't see what they're doing, or they put people in different rooms. They're very strict about the talking or whatever. I don't think that matters. I think it's more fun if you can give the guy next to you a hard time. And as long as you don't just say, I'm ordering 15, and as long as you don't do that, I think it's, or let me tell you what's on the deck of cards, and where you ruin it. That, as long as they're not doing that, I think so. But
We
different.
did have some talking, they didn't do that, but it was impossible to squash any communication. And was really funny when they would occasionally heckle the other tables. They would heckle
Yes,
the
and that
tables.
makes it fun, right? It's, although I've had people like break into tears. I'm like, it's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be a game. Like, weeping is not what, like, in the instructions here. Like, why are we weeping? It's like, I don't know what to do. I can't do it. I'm gonna lose. It's like, it's a game. It's like, dude, come on. But most people have a good time. All right, so that's chaos. So where we're going with this is I want to show you a couple of things. One is I want to take you through a little bit more with translating well-known models into their equivalent system dynamics representation, and how you do that, like literally, so they're identical, and then how you would refine them so people can understand them. But then we also want to look at a very famous oscillating model, which is Jack Homer's worker burnout model. And I've made it into a simulator. I haven't quite finished it, but we can play with it.
Which one is it?
Jack Homer's worker burnout model.
Oh, worker, I've seen that one. That's a very good one. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I've made it into a simulator. I just haven't finished it yet, but it's, we can still play with it in a flight simulator environment, which makes it a little easier to see what's going on. Then after that, most of these models are going to be linear. Lotka-Voltaire is not linear, it's nonlinear, but most of the models you've seen thus far have been linear, right? Even that arms race model we built with the fear factor and all that was all linear, right? So then we're going to start getting into nonlinear models. So we're going to start getting into S-shaped growth and overshoot and collapse and that sort of stuff, right? And then we will build a model from scratch. We'll read a newspaper article and build a model based on the newspaper article and turn it into a flight simulator. Then we'll see how much time remains. I'm not sure where we're at that point, because we're going kind of slow, but that's okay. Slow and methodical is okay, particularly with a small group of people.
Yeah.
Go at our pace. Make sure everybody understands everything.
It allows it to sink in better.
Yeah, because with a large class, you have to just keep going and get through the material, because you can't, somebody's going to pick up quickly. Other people never going to get it. Everybody's in between, and you just got to just push through. But a small thing like this, we can take our time. We can even do more sessions if you want. There's nothing preventing us. Nobody in the main building is monitoring us at WPI. So if you said, look, let's meet again, let's bring Tim in here and meet extra, whatever extra mean. Honestly, most graduate classes meet twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
So, we really can do whatever we want, is what I'm getting at here. The idea is to not just introduce this,
But to model.
this field,
Mm-hmm.
but hook you, saying, I want to do more of this. And you can't hook people if they don't understand it. If they go, I never knew what the hell the guy's talking about. Looks cool, but I can't do this. Or the guy wants me to take another course. I didn't get the material in the first course. How am I going to do the second course? Forget about it. I don't think that's any good, particularly if you're investing in people who are going to go on possibly to do a PhD dissertation. You got to get them started out on the right foot. So I prefer to take time with the new graduate students and get them right-minded and on the right path, so that when we begin to do more sophisticated stuff, our foundation is strong, so to speak. So anyway, that's the idea here. And we have a lot of flexibility. Like I said, no one has any idea what we're doing. When the four of us, including Nejla, my department head has no idea. The provost has no idea. My dean has no idea. People in my house have no idea.
But Sky knows all about it.
Well, my
Because
dog
you're
might know, but
discussing-
nobody else
discussing it
knows.
when they're on the
So-
walk.
yeah, so we can, we
I
can
mean,
do
what if
whatever
we-
we want is what I'm saying.
I mean, and because I do want that good foundation, you know, to go on. So I mean, really, whatever, however much time you think we need to get to all the material that we need to get to, I can definitely make it work another day a week if we move to that. So
Well, okay, so yeah, it just depends on how, if people are digesting, we don't want to do more until, you know, we got everything else under control here, but. So,
I really want to be able to get to the place where we're building models and we're bringing them back. And if we get stuck, we get unstuck, because I think that's where the real learning occurs. I mean, but having the foundation makes sense, but I really want to be building the models and struggle with that together.
yeah, so, well, all right, so, yeah, the first course is not designed to do that because, you know, on average, and we've been, not just me, but we at WPI, and for that matter in the field, have been doing this a long time, teaching people how to do this for a long time, right? And so we kind of know what works and what doesn't. On average, there's always bell curve. Somebody out here is different than somebody, you know, but for most people, we kind of know how to do it. And the first course, usually to try and get them to build an original model is tough. I mean, you can do it. I mean, nobody's stopping you from moving the mouse and, you know, building whatever you want to build, but it's usually more of a struggle than it's worth, and people get turned off because they can't, you know, they're stuck and they're frustrated and whatever. And the course isn't really designed to do that. It's designed just to give you the history of the field, famous models, introduce the software, give you the basics of good modeling practice, small little models, because anyway, you're going to be, even if you build a big model, you're going to be analyzing the small chunks properly, enhance your system dynamics intuition, teach you how to use somebody else's model correctly. All of these are very important before you go and then start, you know, going down the road of building an original model on your own. You know, that's kind of step 2, not step 1. The progression usually is what I just said is the beginner's level. You kind of get it. When you say Forrester Thurman, I know who that is. When you say Stella, I know what that is. I can maneuver around. I can open somebody's model. I get all that. Intermediate level, you start building some models usually, but they're not terribly insightful. They don't really tell you anything you didn't really know, but they're technically correct. And that's good. So, if they're not technically correct, if you got steady state error, you need first order control, you got dimensionally incorrect equations. If I say, you need Little's law there to, you're like, what's that? That's no good. You have to get all that under control, right? Basic, even mundane stuff, plotting. Do you have desired and actual for all of your stocks that are part of negative loops on the same graph on the same scale, for example, with different line thicknesses? Any of that sounds like, oh, that's kind of, but that's super important.
Oh, it is. Just getting around the software sometimes can hurt your brain.
Yeah. And then are you starting to think about a way of a style for keeping track of versions of your model, naming your files, naming your variables? In the beer game, you're going to have a wholesaler, retailer, distributor, and factory, and they're each going to have an inventory. Are you going to say inventory retailer, inventory wholesaler, or are you going to say retailer inventory, wholesaler inventory? Right? Does it matter? Well, it does when you say show me equations alphabetically. You'll have all the inventories together if you do it that way. If you do it the other way, you'll have all the sectors together. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but if you have a large scale model and you're trying to find something, if you have a systematic way of doing things, you can find things way easier, right? And then present them to an audience way easier. So developing, again, sounds mundane, but developing how do you document one of these models so somebody else can reproduce your results? If we have time, we'll talk about that briefly. It's boring as hell, but science is built on replication of results. Somebody can't reproduce your results are no good. Even if they're good, they're going to go, well, I can't reproduce what you did here, right? So, well, how do you document the model so that somebody can do that, right? Super important. So all of these things are just part of the first course, just introducing these concepts, like getting the foundation laid down strong, and then we go from there. And some people say, no mas, enough. I've had, the cup is full. Thanks, but no thanks. Or people say, geez, I want more. You've just given me the taste of the soda pop. I want a full bottle of it, right? You gave me just one swig. I want a whole bottle, right? So it just depends on, that's why, sometimes like, well, take the first course and see if you like it. Because some people like the concept of it, systems thinking, I'm a system, but then they try and do that and they hate math, or they're just not good at it, or they don't think like a system dynamicist does. So it sounded great on paper until they tried to do it, and then they go, yeah, this is really not my thing. Very common. Hate to say it, but very common. Jay and I say, oh, anybody can do system. And I'm like, yeah, it's not been my experience. Think about
I mean, I'm not great in math, but I understand math more the more that I do system dynamics. It starts to make sense. I mean, now I'm starting to get a rhythm of how I could actually write equations if I'm starting to think from the visual system structure perspective. I can back myself into the equations.
One of the problems always dealing with John Sturman and Jay Forrester, and for that matter, all the other MIT guys is their perspective was MIT graduate students, not even MIT undergraduate, MIT. So when you say, well, that's not been my experience, they're like, oh, well, and it's like, dude, you work with MIT PhD students all day long. That's all, or master's students. They are not normal people. I work with normal people. It's not, but the conceptual leap sometimes was lost on them. Like they couldn't tune it down. Like, wear my moccasins for a week or two, Jay, and see what you think, Talk to 18-year-olds at WPI instead of 27-year-old PhD students at MIT. And there's a difference. They're not the same.
Yeah.
It's
I mean, just the first class I took, and they were just throwing around all this engineering jargon, like everybody talks like that. It's like, I do not know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and the folks who go there are it's not just like smart people from every walk of life. It's you're pretty much a technical person when you go. So it's just not representative of humanity is what I'm trying to get at. And so sometimes they go, oh, well, anybody can do it. All you have to do. I'm like, not quite what I've here in the trenches. My back at headquarters, it might make sense, but here on the front lines on the Magno line, it's a little different.
Probably not.
So anyway, all right. So there you go. We went over a little bit here, but we had a lot of chit chat at the beginning. So let's leave it there, and we'll resume next time. We can think about if we want more sessions. We can do that if we want. Let's. We're the snowball's starting to roll down the hill now because we've gotten all the background stuff under wraps, and so maybe we need more. I don't know. We'll ruminate and then we'll discuss. Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds
okay,
good.
y'all.
Thanks,
Thank
Mike.
you. We'll see you next
Good.
time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.